They called me a gold digger in rooms where laughter was supposed to live. Not quietly, not by accident. My mother-in-law said it with a smile sharp enough to cut at dinners at family gatherings once, even in front of people who barely knew my name. And every time I did the same thing, I stayed calm. I stayed seated. I said nothing. They thought silence meant guilt. They thought patience meant weakness. What no one understood was that I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because I knew something they didn't. I knew that words fade, but documents don't. I knew that numbers don't argue. And I knew that the truth, when placed on the table at the right moment, doesn't need defending. That night, when she finally said it again, louder, confident, certain she had won, I reached into my bag. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look angry. I simply brought the papers she never imagined existed. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? If stories about quiet strength and delayed justice speak to you, please consider subscribing. Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that wait to be heard. I didn't grow up expecting to be judged by people who never bothered to ask where I came from. I was raised in a quiet town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows which houses creak in winter and which families have lived on the same street for decades. My parents weren't wealthy, but they were careful. Money was something you respected, not something you showed off. My mother worked 2 jobs when she had to. My father believed that if you signed your name to something, you honored it no matter how inconvenient it became later. That was the environment that shaped me. No shortcuts, no theatrics, just responsibility. By the time I finished college, I was already used to standing on my own. I paid my student loans month by month. I rented a small apartment 30 minutes from work to save on rent. I built my life quietly, without witnesses, without applause. I didn't think that would ever be used against me. I met Daniel when I was 28. He wasn't the kind of man who filled a room with his presence. He listened carefully, spoke thoughtfully, and never tried to impress me with things that didn't matter. We talked about books, about work, about the strange pressure people feel to become someone else the moment they fall in love. On our 4th date, he told me his family had money, old money. He said it like a confession. I remember telling him honestly that it didn't scare me. I had already learned how little money protects you from loneliness, disappointment, or character flaws. He smiled, relieved, as if he'd been holding his breath. I didn't meet his mother until almost a year later. Margaret Reynolds arrived at the restaurant before us, seated perfectly upright, hands, folded eyes, scanning the room as if she were evaluating inventory. When Daniel introduced me, she stood and offered her hand. Her grip was firm, her smile polite, her eyes sharp. She looked me over slowly, not hiding the assessment. So she said, "You're the one." It wasn't a question. From that moment, I understood that I wasn't being welcomed. I was being inspected. Margaret asked about my job, my degree, my family, each question delivered calmly, each one carefully chosen. There was no curiosity in her voice, only calculation. When I answered, she nodded, but nothing softened. It felt like failing an exam without knowing the grading system. On the drive home, Daniel apologized. He told me his mother could be difficult, that she was protective, that she meant well. I told him it was fine. I meant it, at least in part. I had dealt with difficult people before. I just hadn't realized how persistent this kind of difficulty could be. When Daniel proposed, Margaret congratulated him. She did not hug me. When we announced our wedding plans, she suggested a prenuptial agreement, as if it were a formality everyone should expect. I agreed to discuss it without hesitation. That seemed to surprise her. She studied my face longer than usual that day, as if looking for a crack. The wedding itself was beautiful, expensive, and largely orchestrated by her. I let it happen. I chose my battles carefully. I wore the dress she liked. I thanked the guests she invited. I smiled through speeches that praised Daniel's upbringing, his future, his family's legacy. My role was implied, never celebrated. After we married, the comments became more frequent and more pointed. Margaret had a way of speaking that sounded considerate on the surface, but carried sharp edges underneath. She would comment on the neighborhood we lived in, how simple it was. She would ask Daniel in front of me whether he was comfortable covering most of the household expenses. At family dinners, she praised other women she knew, always emphasizing their independence, their accomplishments, their good sense. She never directly accused me of anything. Not at first. She didn't need to. Her tone did the work for her. Daniel tried to step in. He would change the subject, correct her gently, or tell her she was being unfair. Margaret always laughed it off. She accused him of misunderstanding her intentions. She reminded him how much she had done for him, how much she worried about his future. guilt wrapped in concern. It was effective. I didn't push Daniel to confront her more aggressively. I understood how deeply her influence ran. Loving someone doesn't mean demanding they destroy the relationships that shaped them. Sometimes it means enduring discomfort while they learn to see things clearly. What Margaret never asked, what she never seemed interested in, was my life before Daniel. She never asked how I supported myself, how I built my savings, how I managed my finances. In her mind, those details weren't relevant. She had already decided who I was. I noticed how careful she was about when and where she spoke. In private, she was subtle. In public, she grew bolder. She understood witnesses. She understood power. She knew that silence from others often felt like agreement. There were moments when the injustice burned so sharply that I almost spoke out. Moments when staying quiet felt like surrender. But I stopped myself every time. Not because I was afraid, but because I was thinking. I had learned long before I married into Daniel's family that truth isn't just about facts. It's about timing. It's about context. And it's about letting people reveal themselves fully before you interrupt the performance. So I listened. I watched. I remembered. I paid attention to how Margaret framed her remarks as advice, how she masked judgment as concern, how she waited until rooms were full to let her comments land harder. I noticed how others responded, how some smiled uncomfortably, how others avoided eye contact, how no one wanted to be the one to challenge her. And I noticed something else. Margaret was confident. Too confident. She believed she understood everything that mattered about me. That confidence made her careless. It made her predictable. She assumed I had nothing to counter her narrative with. She assumed silence meant guilt. By the time the word gold digger finally left her mouth in front of people who mattered, I wasn't shocked. I was ready. The first time I realized Margaret's comments were no longer accidental, we were sitting around her dining table on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of gathering designed to look warm and effortless, while quietly measuring everyone in the room. The table was long, polished, and set with dishes that matched nothing in our kitchen at home. Crystal glasses caught the light. Linen napkins were folded just right. Margaret believed presentation was a form of authority. If things looked perfect, people assumed everything else was too. She poured wine herself carefully, deliberately stopping just short of generous. When she reached my glass, she paused. "I never know how much to pour for you," she said lightly. "You probably don't drink much, do you?" I smiled and thanked her. Daniel frowned just briefly. No one else said anything. It was small, almost nothing, and yet it stayed with me. From that afternoon on, I began to notice patterns I had previously tried to ignore. Margaret's remarks always arrived wrapped in politeness. They never sounded openly cruel. They were questions, observations, casual comments that could be dismissed if challenged, and they were never isolated. At another family dinner, she asked Daniel if his job had become more stressful now that he had more responsibilities. Her eyes flicked toward me when she said it. At a holiday gathering, she wondered aloud whether it was wise for young couples to maintain separate accounts. She laughed when she said it, as if it were a harmless curiosity. Each time the room responded the same way. Someone changed the subject. Someone laughed nervously. Someone pretended not to hear. Silence has a way of amplifying the wrong voices. Daniel grew increasingly uncomfortable. He spoke to her more firmly, asked her to stop implying things she had no right to imply. Margaret always denied wrongdoing. She insisted Daniel was being defensive. She reminded him how much she worried about his future, how easy it was for outsiders to misunderstand their family values. Outsiders. That word followed me home more than once. At night, lying beside Daniel in our bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed conversations in my head. Not because I wanted to argue, but because I wanted to understand. Margaret wasn't reacting to something I had done. She was reacting to something she believed. And belief, I learned, is far more stubborn than evidence. I started keeping quiet notes, nothing dramatic, just mental records. Dates, locations, who was present, what was said, and how it was phrased. I didn't know yet why I was doing it. I only knew that something in me refused to forget. The escalation was slow, deliberate, almost patient. Margaret began making comments about gifts. If Daniel bought me something, a coat, a watch, she would remark on how generous he was, how lucky I was. When I bought something for myself, she seemed surprised. She asked where I had gotten it. She asked how much it cost. Her questions always landed softly, but they landed. At a family birthday dinner, she raised her glass and toasted Daniel's success. She spoke about his work ethic, his discipline, the sacrifices the family had made for him. Then she turned to me. "And of course," she said, smiling, "we're glad he has someone to share it all with." The room laughed. I smiled too. Inside, something shifted. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. I realized then that Margaret didn't see me as Daniel's partner. She saw me as an accessory, something attached to his achievements, something that benefited but never contributed. What surprised me most was how easily others accepted that narrative. People I barely knew nodded along. People who had never asked about my work, my background, my life before marriage. It was easier to assume than to ask. The word gold digger hadn't been spoken yet, but it hovered close enough to feel its weight. Daniel asked me more than once if I wanted him to confront her more directly. He offered to limit contact to push back harder. I told him not to, not yet. I needed time. Not to prepare a speech, but to let the situation reveal itself fully. Because once someone shows you who they are in private, they will eventually show it in public too. Margaret's confidence grew with time. Her remarks became less subtle when more people were present. She understood audience dynamics. She knew that if enough people heard something often enough, it would begin to sound true. At a charity fundraiser hosted by one of Daniel's relatives, Margaret cornered me near the dessert table. The room was loud, full of conversation and laughter. She leaned in slightly, her voice low but sharp. "You must feel very secure," she said. "Not everyone gets this kind of life handed to them." I met her eyes. "I worked for my life," I replied calmly. She smiled. "Of course you did." Then she turned away. I stood there longer than necessary, my hands resting on the edge of the table, steadying myself. I could feel eyes on me. I wondered how many people had heard. I wondered how many more would hear the next time. That night I told Daniel exactly what she had said. He was angry, more than I had ever seen him. He called her the next day. They argued. She cried. She accused him of choosing sides. She said she felt pushed out, misunderstood, attacked. Daniel came home exhausted. He apologized to me not for her behavior but for not protecting me better. I told him it wasn't his fault. And I meant it. Because this wasn't about one conversation. It was about a pattern. And patterns don't break from one confrontation. Over the next few months, the family gatherings continued. Margaret continued her careful commentary. I continued my silence. People began to feel more comfortable expressing agreement in small ways. A nod here, a joke there. Nothing explicit. Nothing that could be challenged without seeming overly sensitive. And still, no one asked me directly who I was or what I did. There was a strange power in that invisibility. It hurt, yes, but it also freed me from expectation. No one was watching me closely enough to notice what I carried quietly with me. No one suspected that my silence wasn't emptiness. By the time Margaret finally decided to say what she had been implying all along, I had already accepted something important. She wasn't going to stop. And I wasn't going to interrupt her. Because the louder she became, the clearer the truth would sound when it finally arrived. The night Margaret finally crossed the line, there were more people in the room than ever before. It was Daniel's uncle's 60th wedding anniversary, held at a private event space, downtown, white walls, soft lighting, a string quartet playing something elegant and forgettable. Everyone dressed carefully, as if appearance alone could prove belonging. Margaret loved events like this. They gave her an audience. I arrived early with Daniel, helped arrange place cards, greeted relatives I barely knew. I wore a simple black dress, nothing extravagant, nothing that could be questioned. I had learned to think that way around his family, anticipating criticism before it formed. Margaret watched from across the room as people filtered in. She greeted guests with practiced warmth, laughing easily, telling familiar stories. When she spoke to me, her tone was pleasant, almost kind. That alone should have warned me. Dinner was served. Wine flowed. The room softened in that way people do when they feel comfortable, when their guard lowers just enough for honesty to slip through. Margaret stood to make a toast after dessert. The clinking of glasses quieted the room. She smiled, soaking in the attention. She spoke about family, about legacy, about how important it was to protect what generations had built. People nodded along, murmuring agreement. Then her gaze found Daniel. "My nephew has always been generous," she said. "Big-hearted, trusting." Daniel shifted in his seat. "And sometimes," she continued, her voice light, "that generosity can make him vulnerable." I felt it before I understood it, the subtle tightening in the room, the sense that something had changed direction. Margaret turned slightly, her eyes landing on me. "We all want to believe people love us for who we are," she said. "But experience teaches you to be careful, especially when money is involved." The word hadn't been spoken yet, not directly, but it hung there unmistakable. I stayed still. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I focused on breathing evenly. Margaret smiled, satisfied, and raised her glass. "To family," she concluded. Applause followed. Not enthusiastic, polite, uneasy. I didn't leave my seat. I didn't excuse myself. I didn't cry. That surprised people more than any reaction might have. After the toast, conversations resumed, but something had shifted. People glanced at me when they thought I wasn't looking. A few avoided eye contact entirely. Margaret moved through the room, confidently buoyed by the moment. She had said enough without saying too much. She believed she had won. Daniel leaned toward me. "Are you okay?" he whispered. I nodded. "I'm fine." He looked at me closely, searching for something: anger, pain, permission to act. I gave him none. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I understood what that moment required of me. Control. Later that evening near the bar, Margaret approached me directly. There were people close enough to hear, but not close enough to interrupt. She held a glass of champagne, her posture relaxed. "I hope you didn't take my words the wrong way," she said softly. I met her eyes. "I understood them exactly as you intended." She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I only meant that love can be complicated." "Of course," I replied. Her smile thinned. "You know," she added, lowering her voice just slightly, "some people are very good at recognizing opportunity." There it was, finally close enough to truth that it didn't bother hiding. I felt the familiar urge rise to defend myself, to correct her, to list facts she had never bothered to learn. Instead, I let the silence stretch. People nearby grew still. Margaret's confidence wavered just a fraction. "I agree," I said calmly. "Some people are." Then I stepped away. That moment stayed with me long after the night ended, not because of what she said, but because of how comfortable she had become saying it. She believed the room belonged to her. She believed the narrative was already written. Daniel confronted her the next day. Not gently this time. He told her she had humiliated me, that her implications were cruel and unfounded. She denied intent, claimed misunderstanding, accused him of being overly emotional. Then she cried. She always cried when cornered. She told him she was worried about him, about his future, about the possibility that he was being taken advantage of. She reminded him of everything she had provided, everything she had protected. She framed herself as the victim. Daniel came home quiet, weighed down by the conversation. I listened as he recounted it word for word. When he finished, I asked him one question. "Did she apologize?" He shook his head. That was the moment something inside me settled completely. I realized then that Margaret wasn't confused. She wasn't ignorant. She was strategic. And strategy requires response, not reaction. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere changed. Invitations became more formal, conversations more guarded. Margaret watched me more closely now, as if trying to detect movement she hadn't anticipated. She sensed a shift, even if she couldn't name it. At another gathering, she finally said the word aloud. It was a small dinner, less elaborate than the anniversary, but still public enough to matter. She laughed as she said it, like it was a joke everyone was in on. "Well," she said, gesturing lightly in my direction, "I suppose we all know how gold diggers work." The room went quiet. Not silent, but still. No one laughed this time. No one clinked a glass. The word landed heavy, undeniable. I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. I felt eyes turn, waiting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I didn't argue. I looked at Margaret and held her gaze. "I think words like that say more about the person using them," I said evenly, "than the person they're aimed at." She opened her mouth to respond, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the tone. Perhaps it was the way the room no longer felt fully under her control. I excused myself shortly after. Not because I was defeated, but because I had learned everything I needed to know. Margaret had moved from implication to accusation, from private to public, from subtle to explicit. The pattern was complete. And patterns once fully revealed are easy to dismantle. That night alone in our bedroom, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents I had kept out of habit more than intention: contracts, records, statements, proof of a life Margaret had never imagined. I didn't take them out yet. I only confirmed they were still there, because now finally the timing was right. I didn't sleep much that night. Daniel was already asleep when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet rhythm of a house that had slowly stopped feeling neutral. It wasn't just the insult anymore. It was the certainty behind it. Margaret hadn't misspoken. She had decided. And once someone like her decides who you are, everything you do becomes evidence against you. I got up quietly and walked to the small home office we barely used. The drawer slid open with a soft sound. Inside were folders I hadn't touched in years, arranged the way I always kept important things, chronological, labeled unemotional. I sat on the floor and opened the first one. Contracts. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still sharp. Dates, signatures, company names. I remembered the day I signed the first one. I was 24, sitting in a glass conference room with a legal team twice my age, my hands steady, even though my heart was racing. I had earned that seat. No one had given it to me. Margaret didn't know that version of me existed. Before Daniel, before marriage, before being folded into someone else's family narrative, I had built something carefully and deliberately. I had never spoken about it because I had never needed to. My work was confidential. My income was private. And my sense of self didn't require external validation. I had learned early that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. Power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It documents itself. I closed the folder and put everything back. Not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready yet. Showing evidence too early is like revealing the ending of a story before anyone understands the beginning. People don't believe what they're not prepared to accept. The next morning, Daniel noticed my quiet. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was tired. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's behavior shifted again. Now that she had said the word aloud, she didn't bother retreating. She didn't repeat it openly, but she let it echo. She spoke about intentions, about motives, about how money complicated love. Always with a smile, always in front of others. She also became more interested in our finances. At Sunday brunch one morning, she asked Daniel whether we had organized our accounts properly. She asked if I handled money responsibly. She framed it as concern, but her eyes never left my face. Daniel answered for both of us, his voice firm. He said our finances were our business. Margaret nodded, offended but quiet. For the first time, she looked uncertain. That uncertainty didn't stop her. It redirected her. A few days later, Daniel told me she had suggested we meet just the three of us. She wanted to clear the air. I agreed without hesitation. That surprised him. The meeting took place in her living room, a space designed to impress. Everything was symmetrical, deliberate, curated. She offered tea. She spoke softly. She said she felt misunderstood. I worry, she said, folding her hands, that there's a lack of transparency. I waited. In families like ours, she continued, it's important to be careful. Trust is built on openness. Daniel bristled. What are you implying? Margaret sighed, the sound carefully practiced. I'm not implying anything. I just think it's reasonable to understand who we're dealing with. Who we're dealing with. I looked at her and realized something then, something that changed how I saw the entire situation. Margaret didn't want the truth. She wanted confirmation. She wanted proof that her assumptions were correct, not evidence that they were wrong. And that meant no amount of explanation would satisfy her. I'm comfortable with transparency, I said calmly. She looked surprised. You are, yes, I replied, when it's mutual. Her lips pressed together. Daniel watched us closely, sensing tension beneath the surface. Margaret changed the subject soon after, but the message had been delivered. She was preparing to escalate. An escalation I knew would require formality. 2 weeks later, Daniel received an email from her lawyer. She framed it as precautionary. Estate planning, asset protection, a discussion about family trusts and future contingencies. She wanted us present. She wanted documents reviewed. She wanted everything official. Daniel was furious. He saw it for what it was, an attempt to corner me in a professional setting, to force exposure on her terms. He wanted to refuse. I told him no. Let's go, I said. He looked at me confused. Why? Because this is where things become clear, I answered. The days leading up to the meeting were strangely calm. Margaret didn't call. She didn't provoke. She waited. That told me everything. She believed she was finally setting the stage where I would have nothing to hide and nothing to stand on. She had no idea she was doing the same for herself. I didn't prepare speeches. I didn't rehearse explanations. I did something much simpler. I reviewed my documents. I checked dates. I organized everything in order not to defend myself but to let facts exist without interpretation. The night before the meeting, Daniel asked me something he had never asked before. "Why didn't you ever tell them?" he said quietly. "About your work, your past." I thought about it for a moment. "Because I didn't want to be respected for the wrong reasons," I said. "And because I wanted to know who would stand beside me when they thought I had nothing." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry you had to do that." "So am I," replied. "But now we know." The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully. Not to impress, but to remain invisible. I carried my bag, the same one I always used. Inside it, beneath everyday items, were the folders. Margaret greeted us with confidence when we arrived. Her lawyer shook my hand politely, professionally. He didn't look at me like someone being evaluated. He looked at me like someone unknown. That was fine. As we sat down at the table, Margaret smiled, satisfied. She believed she was about to confirm what she had always believed, that I was an addition, a risk, a liability. She didn't realize that the very structure she had built to expose me was about to expose her instead. Because when people insist on transparency without offering respect, they forget one crucial thing. Transparency works both ways. And once the truth is placed on the table, it doesn't care who invited it there. The meeting Margaret arranged didn't feel like a conversation. It felt like a test. We sat in a polished conference room inside her lawyer's office, the kind designed to intimidate without ever raising its voice. Dark wood table, leather chairs, framed certificates lining the walls. Margaret chose the seat at the head of the table without hesitation, as if the space naturally belonged to her. Her lawyer, Mr. Collins, reviewed documents quietly while we settled in. He was polite, efficient, neutral. I noticed that Margaret kept glancing at him as if expecting reinforcement before she spoke. Daniel sat beside me, tense. I rested my hands in my lap, steady. Margaret began with a practiced sigh. "I just want what's best for my family," she said. "And clarity helps everyone feel secure." She slid a folder across the table toward us. "These are the trust outlines," she continued. "We'll be discussing future distributions, responsibilities, and safeguards." Safeguards. I opened the folder and skimmed the pages. Language about asset protection. Clauses about spousal involvement. Conditions that assumed imbalance, one partner contributing, the other benefiting. Margaret watched my face carefully. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. "This meeting is primarily informational," he said. "We're not making binding decisions today." Margaret smiled. "Of course." But the questions came quickly after that. She asked Daniel about his income, his long-term plans, his willingness to protect family assets. Then she turned to me. "And you," she said, tilting her head slightly. "What are your financial expectations?" It was the first time she had ever asked me something that direct. The room felt very quiet. "I don't have expectations," I replied calmly. "I have arrangements." She blinked. "Arrangements, yes," I said. "The same ones I've always had." Daniel looked at me surprised but said nothing. Margaret pressed on. She asked about my savings, my investments, whether I relied on Daniel's income. Each question sounded reasonable in isolation. Together they formed a narrative she had already written. I answered simply. I didn't elaborate. I didn't volunteer context. I let the gaps remain. Mr. Collins watched closely now. His pen paused more often. Margaret's confidence grew as the meeting continued. She leaned back in her chair, sensing control. She spoke about responsibility, about being realistic, about protecting Daniel from complications. At one point, she laughed softly. "I just think it's better to be honest now than disappointed later." That word again. Honest. Daniel finally interrupted. "This feels unfair," he said. "You're treating my wife like a risk." Margaret's expression shifted instantly. Hurt. Offended. "I'm treating the situation seriously," she replied. "That's my job as a mother." I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, not fear, certainty. "I think we should be clear about something," I said quietly. Margaret turned toward me, surprised by the interruption. "I didn't marry Daniel for security," I continued. "And I didn't enter this family unprepared." The words hung there. Mr. Collins looked up fully now. Margaret frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said evenly, "that assumptions have limits." She straightened in her chair. "If you have something to share, this is the time." I met her gaze. "Not today." Her eyes narrowed. Then why say anything at all? Because I replied, "You're asking the wrong questions." The meeting ended shortly after. Margaret was displeased. She masked it well, but the tension followed us out of the building. Daniel was silent in the car, gripping the steering wheel. "She's crossing lines," he said finally. "I won't let her do this to you." "I know," I replied. "But let her continue." He looked at me sharply. "Why?" "Because she's building momentum," I said. "And momentum makes people careless." Margaret didn't stop after that meeting. She escalated. She began suggesting formal financial disclosures between us and the family. She spoke about accountability. She asked Daniel to consider legal protections just in case. She involved relatives in conversations that didn't concern them. At a family lunch, she mentioned how important it was to know who you're investing in. She said it with a smile, but her eyes flicked toward me. This time, no one laughed. The room had changed. Some relatives avoided me now, uncomfortable. Others watched with curiosity. Margaret had pushed the situation into the open whether she realized it or not, and public situations demand resolution. Daniel confronted her again. This time she didn't deny anything. She said she felt entitled to question my intentions. She said she was tired of being made to feel like the villain for protecting her family. "I'm not asking for much," she said. "Just transparency." Daniel asked her directly what she thought of me. She hesitated. Then she said it. "I think she benefits more than she contributes." The sentence was calm, final. Daniel told her that was unacceptable, that she was wrong, that she didn't know me. Margaret crossed her arms. "Then she can prove me wrong." When Daniel told me what she said, I listened quietly. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I nodded. "Okay," I said. He stared at me. "Okay, yes," I replied. "She wants proof. Let's give her the opportunity." "Not yet, but soon." Margaret scheduled another meeting, larger this time, more formal. She invited her lawyer again. She invited Daniel's uncle, who oversaw part of the family trust. She wanted witnesses. She framed it as a necessary discussion, as a responsible step forward, as a chance for everyone to feel reassured. I agreed to attend without hesitation. The night before the meeting, Daniel asked me if I was nervous. "No," I said truthfully. "I'm finished being measured by people who never bothered to learn." I opened my bag and placed the folders on the table between us. Daniel looked at them confused. "What's that?" he asked. "Context," I replied. He opened one folder. His face changed as he read. Then he looked up at me, stunned. "You never told me," he said softly. "I didn't need to," I replied. "Until now." We sat together in silence for a long time. Not heavy, not tense, clear. Margaret believed she was arranging a moment of exposure mine. She believed she was creating a controlled environment, where truth could be demanded, shaped, and judged. She didn't understand one crucial thing. Truth doesn't ask permission to speak, and when people insist on public proof, they should be prepared for public consequences. The next meeting wouldn't be about transparency. It would be about reckoning. The second meeting was nothing like the first. Margaret made sure of that. This time it wasn't held in her lawyer's private office. It was scheduled in a formal conference room at a downtown firm that managed part of the family trust. Neutral ground, but still very public within their circle. Long glass windows, a city skyline in the background. Everything about the setting suggested authority, finality, and judgment. She arrived early. Of course she did. By the time Daniel and I walked in, Margaret was already seated beside her lawyer, a neat stack of folders aligned perfectly in front of her. Daniel's uncle Richard sat across the table reviewing documents. Two other advisors were present, people whose names carried weight in the family, people whose opinions mattered. Margaret looked pleased. She stood when we entered, greeting Daniel warmly. She acknowledged me with a brief nod. Not unkind, not welcoming, professional. That alone told me she believed this meeting would end in her favor. Once everyone was seated, Mr. Collins began outlining the purpose of the gathering. He spoke about transparency, fiduciary responsibility, and long-term planning. He used words like clarity and alignment, carefully avoiding anything that sounded personal. Margaret waited until he finished. "I asked for this meeting," she said, folding her hands, "because I believe unresolved questions only create resentment. I want everything out in the open." She looked around the table, then turned to me. "I think it's fair," she continued, "to understand how my son's marriage affects the family's financial future." There it was again. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence settle. I had learned that silence made people uncomfortable enough to reveal more than they intended. Richard cleared his throat. "We're not here to interrogate anyone," he said carefully. "Of course not," Margaret replied quickly. "This is about reassurance." She slid a document toward me. "These are standard disclosures," she said. "Assets, income, sources, liabilities. Nothing invasive. Nothing invasive." Daniel stiffened beside me. I placed my hand gently on his arm, a quiet signal to stay still. "I'll review them," I said. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "We were hoping to discuss them today." "We can," I replied calmly, "but not in the way you expect." That caught her attention. Mr. Collins looked between us. "If there are documents you'd like us to review, this would be the appropriate time." I nodded. "I agree." For the first time since the meeting began, Margaret leaned forward. I reached into my bag and placed a single folder on the table. Not the whole stack. Just one. Thick enough to be noticeable. Neatly labeled. Margaret stared at it, then at me. "What's that?" she asked. "Background," I said simply. Daniel glanced at me, his expression unreadable but steady. He knew what was coming now. He had read enough the night before to understand the shape of what I carried. Mr. Collins gestured politely. "You're welcome to share." I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table. It was a contract dated years before my marriage. Clear terms, clear compensation, clear signatures. Margaret frowned. "What is this consulting agreement?" I replied. "One of several." Mr. Collins leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He read carefully. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to matter. "This predates the marriage," he said. "Yes," I replied. I slid another document forward, then another, each one methodical, chronological, boring in the way real proof always is. Margaret's confidence faltered just slightly. "I don't understand," she said. "Why are we looking at this?" "Because I said evenly you asked who I was before your son." The room went quiet. Richard leaned in, now interest clearly replacing obligation. One of the advisors scribbled a note. "These figures," Mr. Collins said slowly, "are substantial." "Yes," I replied. "They were." Margaret shook her head once, as if dismissing a bad smell. "Anyone can print papers," she said. "This doesn't prove. These are executed agreements," Mr. Collins interrupted gently. "They include verification and payment records." Margaret turned to him sharply. "I'm not questioning your competence. I'm clarifying facts," he replied calmly. I continued, not rushing, not dramatizing. I explained my work briefly, without names, without unnecessary detail. I explained confidentiality. I explained timelines. I explained independence. I didn't justify. I didn't apologize. I simply stated. Margaret sat back in her chair. Her smile was gone now. "So you expect us to believe," she said, her voice tighter, "that you never mentioned any of this?" "I wasn't asked," I replied. "That's convenient," she snapped. I met her gaze. "So was your assumption." The advisors exchanged glances. The room felt different now, less controlled, less predictable. Mr. Collins asked questions, specific ones. I answered them all, calmly, precisely, without embellishment. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. Margaret tried to regain footing. She questioned relevance. She questioned intent. She questioned timing. I let her. Because the more she spoke, the clearer the contrast became between someone defending belief and someone presenting fact. Finally, Richard spoke. "Margaret," he said slowly, "it appears she was financially independent long before the marriage." Margaret turned to him, stunned. "That's not the point." "What is the point?" he asked. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, everything unraveled. "I just wanted to know who we were dealing with," she said finally. I nodded once. "Now you do." The room stayed silent for a long moment. No one rushed to fill it. Margaret looked around, searching for support. She found none. Mr. Collins closed the folder gently. "From a legal standpoint," he said, "there's no indication of exploitation or dependency here." Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. The meeting ended shortly after, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the direction had changed entirely. People gathered their things quietly. Conversations were restrained, respectful, measured. As we stood to leave, Margaret didn't look at me. Daniel and I walked out together, the city stretching wide through the glass walls. In the elevator, he finally exhaled. "She didn't expect that," he said. "No," I replied. "She expected compliance." He looked at me, something like awe mixed with sadness in his eyes. Why didn't you stop her sooner? Because I said softly she needed to hear it in front of people who could never unhear it. The reckoning wasn't over. Not yet. Margaret had lost control of the narrative, but she hadn't accepted it. And people like her don't retreat quietly. They make one last attempt to reclaim authority. And when they do, they usually choose the most public stage available. Margaret didn't speak to me for 2 weeks after the meeting. Not a text, not a call, not even the polite acknowledgments she usually relied on to maintain appearances. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was strategic. I recognized it immediately. People like Margaret don't withdraw to reflect, they withdraw to regroup. Daniel noticed it too. At first he welcomed the quiet. He said it felt like a break-like space we hadn't had in years. But I knew better. Silence from someone who thrives on control is rarely surrender. It's preparation. The next move came in the form of an invitation. A formal one. Margaret was hosting a family trust review, an annual event that typically involved financial summaries, advisor presentations, and a dinner afterward. It was usually dull procedural, and attended by the same small circle of relatives and legal professionals. This year, however, the guest list was larger. Extended family, board members, even a few longtime business associates. She wanted an audience. Daniel showed me the email, his jaw tight. She's trying to save face, he said. Or worse, she's trying to reframe, I replied. Margaret couldn't undo what had already been acknowledged in that conference room. Too many people had seen the documents. Too many professionals had confirmed the facts. But she could still attempt to control how the story ended by shifting the focus, by casting doubt, by reclaiming moral authority in public. I agreed to attend. The event was held at a private club overlooking the river, the kind of place that required membership and careful adherence to dress codes. Margaret loved environments that came with built-in hierarchy. They made her feel legitimate. The room was arranged with long tables and a podium at the front. A screen displayed financial charts as advisors spoke one by one. Everything was efficient, clean, impersonal. Margaret sat near the front, composed, listening intently. When she noticed me enter, her gaze lingered just long enough to feel intentional. Daniel sat beside me, his posture straight alert. As the formal presentations concluded, Margaret stood. I'd like to address something briefly, she said, smiling at the room. Just to ensure we're all aligned. Here it comes, I thought. She spoke about family values, about trust, about the importance of transparency and honesty, not just legally, but ethically. Her voice was calm, confident, practiced. There have been questions, she continued, about motivations, about intentions. I believe it's important we don't lose sight of what matters. She turned slightly toward me. Some people believe financial independence alone defines contribution, she said. I disagree. Character matters just as much. The room grew still. I felt Daniel tense, ready to speak. I placed my hand on his again. Margaret continued. Money can be earned in many ways, but integrity is proven over time. There it was, the pivot. She couldn't challenge the facts, so she questioned the meaning of them. I waited until she finished. Then I stood. The movement alone shifted the energy in the room. People straightened in their seats. Advisors looked up from their notes. Margaret froze for a fraction of a second, just enough to notice. I agree, I said calmly. Integrity does matter. Margaret's smile tightened. That's why I continued. I think it's important to clarify something publicly since we're discussing values. I walked to the table near the podium and placed my bag down gently. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look angry. I opened the bag and removed a folder. Margaret's eyes fixed on it. This, I said, holding it up slightly, contains documentation that explains why I chose not to speak sooner. Mr. Collins, seated near the front, looked up sharply. I wasn't trying to hide anything, I continued. I was protecting confidentiality, mine and others. But when assumptions are repeated publicly, silence becomes misrepresentation. Margaret shook her head slightly. This isn't appropriate. It is, Mr. Collins said quietly. I placed the folder on the podium and opened it. I didn't hand it around. I didn't dramatize. I simply read dates, terms, roles, compensation, figures clear, verifiable, unembellished. The room didn't react loudly. It didn't need to. The kind of people in that room understood numbers. They understood contracts. They understood credibility. I built my career long before I met Daniel, I said. I supported myself. I paid my obligations. I declined publicity because my work required discretion. I looked directly at Margaret. I never asked this family for money. I never relied on it. And I never needed to prove myself until my silence was used against me. Margaret stood abruptly. "This is unnecessary," she said. "You're turning a private matter into a spectacle." I met her gaze. "You made it public." The advisors exchanged glances. One of them nodded slightly as if something had finally clicked. "I think," Richard said, slowly standing beside me, "we can put to rest any doubts about motive or dependency." Margaret looked around, searching for support. She found none. "I was protecting my son," she said, her voice sharper now. "No," Daniel said, standing beside me. "You were protecting a version of reality that didn't include her truth." The room stayed silent. Margaret sat back down slowly. Her composure fractured, not completely but enough. She didn't speak again. The remainder of the event passed in a blur. People avoided Margaret. A few approached me quietly afterward, not to congratulate but to acknowledge. Subtle nods, brief words, respect without spectacle. As Daniel and I left the club, the evening air felt lighter. "You didn't humiliate her," he said. "You could have." "That wasn't the goal," I replied. Clarity was. Margaret's narrative had collapsed not because I attacked it, but because I refused to support it with my silence any longer. But clarity doesn't always bring peace. For someone like Margaret, it brings one final test. Because when control slips away publicly, the last thing left to try is authority. And authority, when challenged, tends to choose the loudest stage possible. After the trust review, something subtle but irreversible changed. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no raised voices, no public apologies. Instead, there was distance measured, deliberate distance. Margaret stopped pretending. She no longer masked her disapproval with politeness. She simply withdrew, and in doing so, revealed how much of her power had depended on constant presence. For the first time since I married into Daniel's family, I wasn't being watched. Relatives who had once followed Margaret's lead now hesitated before speaking. Invitations arrived late, if at all. Conversations became cautious. People had seen the documents. More importantly, they had seen how calmly I presented them. That mattered. In circles like theirs, composure often counts as credibility. Daniel noticed the shift too. His phone rang less often. His mother stopped offering unsolicited advice. When she did call, her tone was clipped, restrained. She spoke only of logistics, never of feelings, never of me. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The final escalation came from a place Margaret understood best: authority wrapped in formality. One afternoon, Daniel came home with a letter in his hand. Not an email, not a text. A physical letter printed on heavy paper, sealed carefully. "It's from my mother's attorney," he said. I took it from him and read slowly. Margaret was requesting a formal review of marital assets as they related to the family trust. She framed it as procedural, but the language was unmistakable. She wanted legal confirmation on record that I had no claim, no leverage, no influence. She wanted the law to say what she no longer could. Daniel was furious. He said it was harassment. He said we could refuse. He said he was tired of defending our marriage from his own mother. I listened. Then I folded the letter neatly and placed it on the table. "We'll respond," I said. He stared at me. "Why, haven't you done enough?" "Yes," I replied. "And that's exactly why we'll finish this properly." The review was scheduled at a courthouse conference chamber, not a courtroom, but official enough to carry weight. A judge wouldn't preside, but legal officers would. Records would be filed, statements documented. Margaret wanted finality. She wanted certainty. On the morning of the review, I dressed simply. No symbols, no statements, just neutrality. Daniel held my hand as we walked into the building, his grip tighter than usual. Margaret was already there. She sat upright at the long table, flanked by her attorney and a legal advisor. She didn't look at me when I entered. She didn't need to. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about validation. The legal officer began by outlining the purpose of the review: neutral language, clear boundaries. This was not a trial, but a clarification of interests. Margaret's attorney spoke first. He presented arguments about asset protection, family legacy, and the importance of minimizing external influence. He never used my name directly. He didn't have to. When it was my turn, I stood calmly. "I'd like to submit documentation," I said. The legal officer nodded. "Proceed." I placed several folders on the table, not all of them, just enough. Contracts, statements, records already acknowledged by professionals. Nothing emotional, nothing speculative. I explained my position succinctly. I am not seeking access to the family trust, I said. I never have. My financial independence predates my marriage. My assets are separate. My intent has always been partnership, not entitlement. Margaret's attorney attempted to interrupt. The legal officer raised a hand. Let her finish, he said. I continued. I am here because my silence has been interpreted as something it is not. This review exists because assumptions were made without inquiry. I am prepared to clarify those assumptions fully. I met Margaret's gaze for the first time that morning. This ends today. The room was quiet. The legal officer reviewed the documents carefully. He asked a few questions, technical, precise. I answered each one. Margaret shifted in her seat, her posture no longer composed. After a brief recess, the officer returned. Based on the materials provided, he said, there is no legal basis to suggest dependency, undue influence, or financial risk associated with this marriage. Margaret's face tightened. This review, he continued, confirms that the spouse in question maintains independent assets and poses no claim to the family trust under existing agreements. It was over. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Legally. Margaret didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply nodded once stiffly, as if acknowledging a verdict she had expected but hoped to avoid. Outside the building, Daniel exhaled deeply. I'm sorry it came to this, he said. So am I replied. But now it's done. Margaret didn't speak to us as we left. She walked past without a word, her heels echoing sharply against the floor. For the first time, she looked smaller. Not defeated, just exposed. That evening, Daniel and I sat together in our living room, the house quiet again. But this time the quiet felt different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't watchful. It was free. I realized then that the hardest part hadn't been being called a gold digger. It hadn't been the insults or the assumptions or even the public moments of humiliation. The hardest part had been waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the right audience. Waiting for the truth to speak without distortion. People often think strength looks like confrontation. Like shouting back. Like proving yourself at the first accusation. But sometimes, strength looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like letting someone build their case fully so that when it collapses, it does so under its own weight. Margaret had wanted certainty. She had wanted authority. She had wanted the law to validate her belief. Instead, the law had done something far more final. It had removed her voice from the question entirely. And in that silence, for the first time since I married into that family, I finally stood on ground that was indisputably mine. The public acknowledgement didn't happen the way I imagined it might. There was no announcement, no family-wide email, no formal apology issued on heavy stationery. Margaret Reynolds didn't admit she was wrong in words. She did something far more telling. She lost her authority. It became obvious at Daniel's cousin's engagement dinner, a large gathering held at a downtown restaurant, the kind of event Margaret once controlled effortlessly. She arrived late this time. Not fashionably late, just late enough to miss the moment when people chose their seats. That alone changed everything. I noticed it immediately. So did everyone else. When Daniel and I entered, conversations paused briefly, then resumed not awkwardly but differently. A few people smiled at me directly. Some nodded. One of Daniel's aunts squeezed my hand and said quietly, "It's good to see you." Margaret watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. She sat near the end of the table now, not the center. When she spoke, people listened politely, but they no longer deferred. Her opinions didn't shape the conversation. They floated unanchored. At one point, someone asked about the trust review casually without drama. "I heard things were clarified," a business associate said, glancing between Margaret and Daniel. Daniel answered calmly, "Yes, everything was resolved." Margaret said nothing. The silence wasn't hostile. It was factual. And facts once established don't need repetition. I realized then that justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives as a shift in posture, in who people look to before they speak, in whose opinion quietly stops mattering. Margaret tried once to reclaim the narrative. A few weeks later, she invited us to lunch, just the three of us. Neutral territory, a quiet restaurant she used to favor. She spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it might be used against her. "I never intended to hurt you," she said finally, staring into her cup. I was acting out of concern. I didn't respond immediately. Concern that humiliates isn't concern. But I didn't say that. I didn't need to. I understand fear, I replied instead. I just don't accept judgment disguised as protection. She looked up sharply, then away. Daniel spoke then. His voice was steady, unmistakable. This stops now, he said. No more questions. No more insinuations. You either respect my wife, or you don't get access to our lives. Margaret stiffened. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she had no leverage. The lunch ended without resolution, but also without conflict. That was new. Margaret no longer held the upper hand. She knew it. And knowing it changed how she moved through the world. Over the following months, the family dynamic restructured itself quietly. Invitations came directly to us, not through Margaret. Conversations included me without hesitation. Decisions were made without consulting her first. She wasn't excluded. She was simply no longer central. One evening, Daniel asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you regret not speaking sooner?" he asked. I thought about it carefully. "No," I said. "If I had the truth, would have sounded defensive. Now it sounds final." He nodded. He understood. I thought about the woman Margaret had tried to define me as opportunistic, dependent, calculating, a shadow version built from assumption rather than observation. I realized something important then. She hadn't been threatened by my presence. She had been threatened by my independence. People like Margaret are comfortable with power when it's predictable. They understand hierarchy. They rely on it. But independence, quiet, unadvertised independence, disrupts systems built on control. She couldn't place me, so she tried to label me. That label failed. Months later, at another large family gathering, someone made a careless joke about gold diggers. The room went still, not because of offense, but recognition. "That's not funny," someone said simply. Margaret was there. She said nothing. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I just continued eating. That was the moment I knew it was truly over. Not because I had won an argument, but because the story had changed and no one was willing to tell the old version anymore. Later that night, as Daniel and I drove home, I looked out the window and felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on silence or avoidance, the solid kind that comes from clarity. From boundaries enforced without aggression. From truth that no longer needs defense. Margaret would never apologize the way movies promise. She would never say the words that might have made things easier to explain to others, but she had lost the thing she valued most: control. And in its absence, I gained something far more important. The right to stand in any room without shrinking. The right to be known for what I had built, not what others assumed. The right to exist without explanation. Justice hadn't come with fireworks or vindictive pleasure. It came with a quiet rearrangement of power. And in that rearrangement, the woman once dismissed as a gold digger finally stood where she always had, on her own ground. What followed wasn't reconciliation. It was recalibration. Margaret didn't disappear from our lives, but she no longer occupied the space she once dominated. She attended events, sent polite messages on holidays, asked neutral questions about Daniel's work. She never mentioned money again. She never mentioned my past. And she never not once used my name alongside suspicion. It wasn't warmth, it was distance with boundaries. And for the first time, those boundaries weren't imposed by her. They were mine. I noticed the change most clearly in small moments, the ones people rarely talk about, when decisions were made without consulting her first, when relatives asked me for my opinion without checking her expression, when Daniel spoke freely around his family, no longer choosing words to avoid triggering a reaction. Margaret watched these shifts quietly. She wasn't oblivious. She simply had no tools left to intervene. One afternoon, months after the legal review, Daniel and I hosted a small gathering at our home. Nothing elaborate. Just close relatives and a few friends. Margaret arrived with a gift and a smile that looked practiced but not hostile. She complimented the house. She asked about my work, not probing, not dismissive, just a question. It felt strange, almost unsettling. I answered briefly. She nodded. That was it. No follow-up, no commentary. Later that evening, as people began to leave, Margaret lingered near the door. Daniel was in the kitchen. For a moment, it was just the two of us. "I didn't expect things to turn out this way," she said quietly. I waited. "I thought I was protecting my family," she continued. "But I realize now, I didn't know everything. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't nothing either." "I never asked you to protect me," I replied gently. Only to respect me. She nodded once. Then she left. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. There's a difference. Victory demands witnesses. Resolution doesn't. In the weeks that followed, I reflected on how easily I had been misjudged and how long I had allowed it to continue. Not because I believed it, but because I underestimated the cost of silence. Silence can be powerful, but it isn't neutral. When used carefully, silence reveals character. When used too long, it allows others to define you. I thought about the woman I had been when I first married, Daniel, careful, accommodating, willing to absorb discomfort to keep peace. I didn't regret her. She had done what she thought was necessary at the time. But I also recognized the woman I had become, someone who understood that peace built on self-erasure is not peace at all. Daniel noticed the change, too. "You don't hesitate anymore," he said one evening as we sat together on the couch. "I don't need to," I replied. He smiled. "I'm glad you didn't let them break you." "They didn't," I said. "They revealed me." There were still moments of discomfort. Family histories don't rewrite themselves overnight. Margaret occasionally slipped into old habits, interrupting, advising, assuming. But each time the response was different now. Someone corrected her, or she corrected herself. The system had changed. One night, Daniel asked me something that surprised me. "Would you have stayed if I hadn't stood up when I did?" he asked. I thought carefully before answering. "Yes," I said, "but not like this." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry it took me so long." "It didn't," I replied. "You arrived when it mattered. We had learned something together through all of it, something neither of us could have learned alone. That love doesn't require endurance of disrespect. That loyalty isn't silence. And that boundaries are not punishments, they are clarity. I also learned something about people like Margaret. They don't fear confrontation. They fear exposure. They are comfortable when power is unchallenged, when roles are predictable. When silence fills the gaps, they don't want questioned. What unsettles them is not noise, but certainty. Certainty without apology. I never confronted Margaret emotionally. I never demanded an apology. I never asked her to acknowledge the harm she caused. I didn't need to. The system that supported her assumptions no longer supported them. That was enough. As time passed, I noticed something else begin to happen, something quieter but deeply meaningful. Other women in the family began to speak more freely. One cousin confided that she had always felt dismissed. An aunt admitted she had learned to stay quiet to keep peace. Even a friend of the family once pulled me aside and said, "I'm glad someone finally didn't shrink." I hadn't planned to be an example, but I had become one simply by standing still long enough for the truth to speak. And that mattered, because the story was never really about money. It was about value. Who gets to define it? Who gets to assume it? And who is allowed to possess it without explanation? Margaret had tried to reduce me to a motive, a stereotype, a threat. What she couldn't accept was that my value existed independently of her approval, that it always had. One evening, months later, I returned to that drawer in the home office, the one that had held my documents for years. I opened it, looked at the folders, then closed it again. I didn't need them anymore. They had served their purpose. The truth, once spoken clearly, doesn't need to be carried around like armor. It becomes part of the air. And in that air, I finally felt something I hadn't felt since before I married into Daniel's family. Ease. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was hidden. Margaret no longer defined me. And more importantly, I no longer waited for permission to define myself. The final shift didn't arrive with a confrontation. It came quietly, almost invisibly, the way real endings often do. A year after everything had settled, after the meetings, the documents, the unspoken recalibration of power, Daniel and I attended a large family gathering hosted by the Trust's board. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. Annual reports, long tables, open seating, a public space filled with people who valued order, structure, and appearances. Once Margaret would have owned that room. This time, she didn't. She arrived on time, dressed impeccably, carrying herself with the same rigid confidence she always had. But the room didn't shift when she entered. Conversations didn't pause. People didn't look to her before speaking. Authority had redistributed itself so naturally that no one announced it, including her. I watched Margaret from across the room, not with resentment but with clarity. She moved more cautiously now. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she chose her words, carefully aware, perhaps for the first time, that they might not be protected by silence. Daniel sat beside me, relaxed. That alone felt like a victory we never discussed. During the meeting, a discussion arose about future leadership roles within one of the family's foundations. Names were suggested, opinions offered. Margaret spoke once briefly, then stopped. Another voice took over. Someone younger, someone measured, someone who hadn't been there years ago. Margaret didn't interrupt. I realized then that this was the moment she had feared all along. Not humiliation, not exposure, replacement. Power doesn't vanish, it moves. After the meeting ended, people gathered in small clusters, talking casually. I was approached by one of the advisors, someone who had been present during the trust review months earlier. "I wanted to say," he said quietly, "you handled everything with remarkable restraint." I nodded. "Thank you." "Most people would have reacted sooner," he added. "Yes," I replied, "but reacting wasn't the point." He smiled knowingly and walked away. Margaret saw the exchange. Our eyes met briefly across the room. There was no hostility in her expression, no apology either. Just understanding. She nodded once. And for the first time since I had known her, the gesture didn't feel performative. It felt final. Later that evening, Daniel and I stood near the windows overlooking the city lights. The skyline stretched wide, indifferent to family dynamics and old resentments. I felt grounded in a way I never had before. "Do you feel finished?" Daniel asked quietly. I thought about it. "Yes," I said. "I do." Not because everything had been repaired. Not because relationships had become warm or affectionate. But because nothing remained unresolved inside me. That mattered more. I thought back to the woman I had been at the beginning of this story, the one who sat quietly through insults, who absorbed judgment to preserve peace, who believed patience alone would protect her dignity. She hadn't been wrong. But she hadn't been complete either. I learned something essential through all of this, something no one teaches you directly, that silence is only powerful when it is chosen, not imposed, that patience is only virtuous when it doesn't erase you, and that dignity doesn't come from enduring disrespect, it comes from knowing when to stop accommodating it. Margaret never apologized in the way people expect in stories like this. There was no emotional confession, no dramatic acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no tearful reconciliation. But she did something far more difficult. She stopped. She stopped questioning. She stopped implying. She stopped positioning herself above me. She accepted the boundaries she could no longer cross. That was her apology. In the months that followed, Daniel and I built a rhythm that felt entirely our own. Family events no longer carried tension. Conversations flowed without hidden meanings. I spoke freely. I laughed without calculating. I existed without scanning rooms for judgment. And when new people entered our lives, new partners, new spouses, new voices, I watched how the family treated them, differently, more carefully, as if a lesson had been learned, even if no one ever named it. Sometimes late at night, I thought about how easily this story could have gone another way, how reacting too soon could have turned truth into defensiveness, how speaking without context could have allowed others to dismiss me as emotional, dramatic, or opportunistic. Waiting had been painful. But waiting had also been precise. Justice, I learned, doesn't always arrive when you ask for it. It arrives when the ground is prepared to receive it, and when it doesn't shout, it settles. The label Margaret once used, gold digger, no longer carried weight, not because I disproved it loudly, but because the world around it refused to hold it up anymore. That is the quiet power of truth. It doesn't need belief. It needs space. I never raised my voice. I never attacked her character. I never asked anyone to take my side. I let the facts stand, and in doing so, I stood too. Not above anyone, not against anyone, just firmly, unmistakably in my own place. Sometimes the hardest lesson life teaches us is not how to fight back, but how to wait without losing ourselves. There will be moments when you are misunderstood, mislabeled, or quietly judged by people who never took the time to truly see you. In those moments, it's tempting to explain everything, to defend every truth, to prove your worth as loudly as possible. But real strength doesn't always demand an immediate response. Sometimes strength is knowing who you are so deeply that you don't rush to correct those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Silence, when chosen, not forced, can be a form of dignity. It gives you time to understand the situation, to prepare, and to let reality reveal itself without distortion. Because the truth doesn't lose its power when it waits. It gains clarity. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't need shouting. It stands on its own. If this story resonated with you, maybe it's because you've been there too, holding your ground quietly, carrying your truth while the world assumed something else. If so, you're not weak, you're patient. And patience paired with truth is one of the most powerful forces there is. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? More importantly, have you ever been underestimated, and how did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you believe in stories about quiet strength, delayed justice, and standing tall without losing your humanity, please consider subscribing to the channel. Sometimes the people who wait the longest are the ones who deserve to be heard the most.